code where we don't have this nested callback mess. All right, and once we have covered why it's so important to use the asynchronous approach, now, of course, let's clean up our FA sync. So instead of using these nested callbacks, let's see a nicer pattern. And as a side note, if you want to see the code that we wrote in a previous video and the one we're about to write, then the files are located in two async patterns folder. So I'll close everything for now. And then back in app.js, I can remove it. Like I said, if you want to access that code, it is sitting in the two async patterns folder. And we'll simply start by recreating the read file setup, where I'm going to go with const, and I'm right away accessing that from the file system module, and I'll set it equal to require, of course, and then file system. All right, well, that's awesome. We know that it is asynchronous, so we need to set it up with 3 parameters. We go with read file, and then we would want to pass in path first. So again, since I'm in app.js, I'm going to be looking for the content, and then / and then first txt. The file we already created before. Then we have encoding, so comma, and then again we're going to go with UTF-8, and then last one is going to be that callback, where the first value is the error, and then the second one is the data that we're getting back. Okay, awesome. So once the file system responds, then of course we invoke this callback, and inside of that callback we have our logic. So if there's going to be an error, for the time being, I will just return like so, and then if I have the data, I'll set it up as else. So I'll say here console log and data, of course. And we shouldn't be surprised if we see in a console, hello, this is a first text file, because we already covered the setup, right? So we pass in the path, we pass in the encoding, and then we set up the callback. Now the problem starts if we would want to perform multiple actions. If I want to read 2 files and then, for example, write one, correct? So what would be a better solution? Well, a better solution would be turning this into a promise. And then eventually we'll set up async await. Now, please keep in mind that the only reason why we'll type out the promise stuff is because I would want you to understand what is happening behind the scenes. But don't worry, throughout the course, we'll just stick with async and await syntax. And essentially, you won't have to worry about what is happening behind the scenes. But the first example, yes, I want you to understand everything in detail. So what we could do is create a new function, and we can just say const, and then I'll call this getText. Now this getText will take a path, since I would want to read 2 files, and then eventually write one as well, just like we did here. And of course, the goal here is to showcase how we can make the code in the file fs async, at least that's how I called my file, much cleaner and more readable. So again, we pass in the path, and then what I would want to return from this function is a promise. So we go with return new promise, and then in the promise object, what we need to pass in is another callback function. So we pass in the callback function, and in here we pass in 2 more functions, one for resolve and then one for reject. And then once I have set up both of these parameters, now of course what I would want is to move the read file and place it inside of the promise one. Okay, so once we place it here, first of all, notice here how I'm passing in the path. So of course I can change this one around. So I can say path, and then the encoding stays the same as well as the callback. However, inside of the callback, once I have access to resolve and reject, what I could simply say that if there's an error, I will spit back the error. So say reject an error. And if everything goes great, now of course, let's go with a resolve, and then we'll pass in the data. And once we have this setup, what's really cool that now I can invoke getText, and this is going to return a promise. And then of course we can chain .then and catch. So below the getText, I can go with getText, and of course we're looking for the path. So we still would need to use dot and then / and then content, of course, then first txt. So that's the path. And then, like I said, we are returning a promise. So we can chain dot then. And of course, here I can have the result. And I'll just console log it for now. Result. And then I can also chain dot catch. And here I'm passing in the error. So again, we console log it, and we simply would want to see the error. I save it, and beautiful. Again, in a console, I have hello, this is first text file. So I know that it worked. And also, if I change the path, so if I make my path incorrect, we should see in the console the error, where of course Node cannot find the file. So if that works, now of course we can take a look at how we can make it even cleaner by setting up async await. And once we have our initial setup, once we have turned this into a promise, technically we're not out of the woods. Because if I would want to perform again 2 file reads and then eventually write the file as well, and if I would want to do all of that asynchronously, it's still going to be pain just by using the promises. So what would be a solution? Well, since we're returning a promise, if I use async await, I can wait till promise is settled and then decide what I would want to do. And the way we set that one up is by creating a new function. Now, please keep one thing in mind, where eventually throughout the course, those functions that I'm about to set up are going to be provided to us. So we'll just attach that async to the callback functions that are already provided us by the libraries. Okay. But in this example, I'll have to create one from the scratch. And again, the whole point is because I would want to create a function, a start function, that I'm going to set it up as a synchronous function, and I would want to attach a wait. So I would only respond once the promise is settled. So in here I go const start, and that's my function, but I need to set it up right away as async because I would want to use my await keyword, correct? And then we simply go with const, and I know that, of course, I'm looking for the first file, and I'll just say first, and that one is equal to get text. And basically, I want to pass in the same thing here. Now, I do need to place this one in quotation marks. So my bad, I messed it up a little bit. Okay, I pass it in, and that should do it. Now, of course, what I'm missing here is await. So I had this await, and now only once the promise is resolved, then I'll get my response. So what I could do here is just comment these two, or you know what, this one I cannot comment out yet. Don't worry, we will eventually. This one I can comment out and then maybe move this below. Okay, so you don't think that I'm running this code. And since I have my function now, of course, I would need to invoke it. So invoke start and check it out. Now, of course, I don't have the error, which is a good sign, I guess. And then we'll simply go with log and then first. And notice the difference. Where previously, when we were setting up the callbacks, we had to nest everything. Now I'm waiting for this promise to be resolved. And only once it's resolved, then of course I can do something with the value. Now, every time we have this async await approach, what we would want is to wrap this in the try catch block. So if something goes wrong, then we have at least a little bit of control over it. So I'll set up try catch block, and then I'll set up my first await, and eventually we'll add here more. And then in the error, I'll simply go with console log, and we'll console log the error. And let's just save that one. So now we have nice try and catch block. And by the way, sorry, I deleted it. We'll still take a look at the first one. And then if we change the path, then of course we'll get an error. Okay, so that's good. Now I have my start function. It is asynchronous. I'm waiting for the promises to resolve. They're all wrapped in try catch block. So what's next? Well, if you remember in here, what were the actions that we were doing? Well, we read 2 files, correct? And then we wrote one. Okay, so let's try that one with this new approach, where essentially I have first, so I'll just copy and paste, and then I'll look for the second file. Remember, we should have that in the content. So this is going to be the second one. second over here, and then I would want to write the file. Now, of course, you could say, well, the problem here is going to be that I'll have to write a new wrapping function to set it up as a promise. Because yes, we can of course read the file, but the functionality for the write file, again, we would need to wrap it. Don't worry, there's a way how we can get this actually out of the node. First, I would just want to showcase how much cleaner this already is, where I can just wait for first, second, like so, and now notice in the console, hello, this is the first text, and hello, this is the second file. Again, I fully understand that you're looking at this wrapper function and you're like, well, this definitely doesn't look that much cleaner than this one. Don't worry, there's a way for us to get those functions in a way that they're already returning a promise. What I would want you to focus on is this code. What I would want you to understand that this definitely is much cleaner than what we have here. We read a file, and then we set up another nested callback, and another nested callback, and hopefully you get the gist. Waiting for these promises to resolve is definitely a cleaner and more readable approach. All right, so this works. We have our start function. It is asynchronous. We're waiting for the promises to resolve, and we can see that it is already much cleaner. How we can set up this code without the wrapping function? Well, what's really cool that in Node, there is a module by the name of util. And we'll just go here, const, and we'll assign it to a variable. And we'll just be looking for require, of course, since we would want to import the module. And again, the name is util. And then inside of this module, we have a method by the name of promisify. And with the use of this function, we can take our read file, which of course was looking for the callback, and turn it into the function that returns a promise. And again, this is oversimplified version of what is happening there, but hopefully you understand that as a result, we'll get again this promise back. Now, the way we'll set that up, of course, we have read file here already, so I cannot use the same name. That's why I'll go with read file, and we'll call this promise. And that one is equal to util. That is, of course, my module dot, and then notice the function promisify, and then we pass in that read file function. So now I have my promise one. So now what I could do is, first of all, comment this out and move it down. Again, so it stays for your reference, but it doesn't compromise my view. And of course, now I'll have the error because, well, get text is not defined. That's fine, don't worry. And I'll copy and paste. And since I also would want to write a new file, I will get from the file system one the write file function. And then I'll do the same thing, where in this case, it's going to be called write file promise. And then we pass in write file. And of course, now instead of calling get text, what I'm going to do is go with write file, or I'm sorry, in this case, we're going for read file promise. And then keep in mind one thing, where this is not a get text one. So we're still looking for the path as well as the encoding. That's why I'll copy and paste. And then the second argument we pass in is the encoding. And again, our functionality shouldn't change, where I should see in the console the results from the first txt. Now, of course, I would want to do the same thing with the second one. So have read file promise, second txt. Again, we have to pass in the encoding, otherwise we'll get the buffer back. So copy this and paste. And again, if we console log it, there it is. We have, hello, this is first text file, and this is the second one. And since in the line 4, we passed in write file into promisify. Of course, what we could also do is right away write the file. So I can go with await, and I'm simply not assigning this to a variable because, well, I'm getting back undefined there as far as data. And I'm just going to go with await, write file promise, and the same spiel. We pass in first the path. And in this case, of course, if the file is not there, Node will create one. and the name will be result, and I'll just call this mine grenade and then txt, and then the second one is data. So for that one, I'll set up my template string, and I'll just say this is awesome, awesome, and then let's set up the colon, and then we'll access both first as well as the second one. So we'll interpolate both of them, second, and then once we save, if we take a look at the content, there it is. Now we have the mine grenade one, correct? Now there's probably one where I was testing. Yep, there's one where I was testing, so I'll remove this one. But if I take a look at the txt one, then of course I'll have this is awesome. Hello, this is first text file, and then I have the second one. Now, what's even more cool, that technically we can even skip this part as well. Again, I'll leave this one for your reference. But if you go to require, and then you require, of course, file system module, but if you add dot promises, what do you think is going to return? Well, effectively the same thing. So now, of course, I just need to change the name from read file promise and write file promise back to read file and write file, since those are the two functions that I'm importing, and they will right away return promises. And again, we save, and remember that by default, we're just overriding stuff. So if I were to go and add a third argument, my options one, and if I'm just going to say flag and I'll set it equal to append, once we save, well, now we have this is awesome. Repeat it one more time. Again, just to showcase that our functionality still works. I fully understand that there was a little detour where we created our own wrapper function, and then we covered how we would consume promises. But hopefully this helps you understand that this approach is definitely way better. So it is more readable. It is more easier to wrap your head around. And that's why for the remainder of the course, we'll stick with this one. Again, some things will be provided to us by default. So libraries will provide the functions that return promises. Will right away have the callback functions that we'll just set up as async, and hopefully you get the gist. So a lot of things will be given to us, but the core functionality won't change, where instead of using callbacks and nesting them inside of the other callbacks and nesting more and more and more, we'll set up everything with async await, because the syntax is cleaner and way easier to read. Excellent. Once we have covered async patterns we're going to use throughout the course, now let's talk about events in Node.js. When working on browser JavaScript apps, a big part of our work is to handle events. For example, user clicks a button, and of course, in our program, we handle that. User hovers over the link, and again, same deal. In our program, we are handling that. And hopefully you get the gist. Essentially, as our program executes, at least in part, it is controlled by events. Of course, depending on a program, but it's safe to say that in browser app, those events are mostly external. Now, that style of programming is actually called event-driven programming. And effectively, it's just that, a style in which the flow of the program is at least in part determined by the events that occur as the program executes. Now, it's easier to imagine that, of course, when you have a GUI, right? The graphical interface, just like the button and links example I just mentioned. But what about server side? Is it also possible? And of course, the answer is yes. In fact, event-driven programming is used heavily in Node.js. And in the following videos, we'll see some of the examples of it. And basically, the idea is following. We listen for specific events and register functions that will execute in response to those events. So once our event takes place, callback function fires, just like in our imaginary button example. Now, before we continue, let me stress something. Our first examples are going to be basic and even somewhat silly, but don't let that fool you. Many built-in modules in Node.js do use events under the hood, and therefore making events and event-driven programming a big part of Node.js. All right, and once we have covered general concepts behind events as well as event-driven programming, now let's set up our own events in Node. And the way we do that, we come up with a variable, and typically this name is event emitter, because what we're getting back is the class, and we require the events module. So we require events module, and we assign it to a variable, which essentially is a class. And again, a common practice is calling this event emitter. And at this point, you have two options. If you want to create something custom, you'll need to extend the class, or if you simply want to emit an event as well as listen for it, then you can just create the instance. So we'll go with the second route. We'll go with const and then whatever name you would want. In my case, I'm just going to call this custom emitter, like so. And I'll assign it to new emitter, so event emitter, or however you call this variable. And we just need to invoke it. So now we have the instance of our class. So essentially, we have the object. Now, there are many methods in this object. However, two that we're interested in most are on and emit. So on will listen for specific event, and then emit, of course, will emit that event. And the way we set it up, we go with custom emitter or whatever name you used, and then we go with on. And at the very basic setup in the on method, we just pass in the string where we say the name of the event. Now, in my case, I'll name my one response. And then, of course, once I have subscribed to it, I also would want to pass in the callback function. So essentially, when this event takes place, well, then I would want to do something. And in my case, I'll just go with console log, and we'll simply say data received. However, I'll place this one in the template strings, and you'll see in a second why. So we'll go with data received, and then eventually there's going to be some more data. And of course, once we have subscribed to this specific event, now I would want to emit it. And the way we do that, we just go with custom emitter. And then, of course, the method is, surprise, surprise, emit. And of course, at this point, these strings need to match. So if I'm emitting the response event, I just say here response. And what you'll see in the console is wherever you have in a callback. So of course, in my case, I have console log data received. And then once I run it, I have data received in a console. So that's the most basic setup when it comes to events. Again, we create an instance from the class that we get back from the events module. And then we have two methods. We have on method as well as the emit method. And then in the on method, we pass in a string. So that's going to be the name of the event as well as the callback function. So once this event takes place, then of course we would want to do something. And in our case, we'll just console log data received. And then once we have subscribed to this event, then of course we need to emit it. And the way we do that, we just go with whatever the name is, in my case, custom emitter, then emit method, and then we pass in the same string that we're listening for. In our case, of course, response. And then the moment we do that, we of course have whatever is in the callback function, which in our case, of course, is just a simple log data received. All right. And once we have covered the basic setup, now let me show you some things that I would want you to be aware of. First, we can have as many methods we would want. So for example, we have the same event. We have here response, correct? And we are omitting it. So nothing stops me here. Just copy and paste and listen for the same event, which of course in our case is this response, and then do some other logic in my callback. Again, in my case, it's just going to be simple, different console log. So I'm going to say some other logic here. And I'm not going to copy and paste the same function 20,000 times just to prove my point, but hopefully you understand that yes, we can emit our event, and then yes, also we can have as many functions we would want here that are listening for that event and do some other logic. So that's point number one. Point number two that I would like to make is the fact that this order matters. So we first listen for event and then we emit it. So for example, if I will place my emit above the second function or above both of the functions, what you'll notice that I have nothing in a console. Why? Well, because I first emit the event and only then I listen for it. As you can see, that doesn't make sense. So first we would want to listen for the event and only then we would emit it. So in this case, notice I don't have this some other logic goes in here because I listen for response and then I right away emit the response. And then again, I listen for the response, but I already emitted the event, correct? So it doesn't make sense to listen for the event once it has been already emitted. So that's the point number two. And then thirdly, I would also want to showcase that we can pass the arguments when we're emitting the event. So for example, I go here with my emit, I pass in the name, which is of course response, and then I can pass in more arguments. For example, here I'll go John and then the ID number 34. So string and a number. And then in my callback function, I can access those arguments as parameters, just like normal functions. So in this case, I'll call them name and ID. And simply in my console log, I'll say name. And the second one will be with ID. And then whatever is that ID. Now I'll add here data received user and then save it. And it's no surprise that in the console, I see data received user John with ID 34. Now in the second function, as you can see, I wasn't looking for those arguments.